So CDPR just hosted their half-one earnings call for Cyberpunk 2077. In this, we got to hear a bit more from the developers themselves, and they actually start this off with a pretty clear message describing how work on Cyberpunk 2077 will continue for as long as it is necessary, with their ultimate goal being that they want to deliver on that promise they gave to gamers and regain the trust of gamers. This is something they reiterate throughout the call and actually somewhat back up with numbers. And overall throughout this, we get a bit of an update as to what the rest of 2021 will look like. Some vague numbers here or there that we can take together with other outside information, as well as we actually get some of the revenue and sales numbers for the game that are particularly interesting. So one of the big topics they touch on during this is the next gen version of the game. And they keep using this phrase that the target date for the next gen version is late 2021. And as they mentioned this several times throughout, they continuously use the target date and almost have like a caution around that, being like, hey, we're still developing this, we're still working on that content, and things are subject to change. They talked about that being a target date and gave that almost warning with it, not only the first time they brought it up themselves, but then also when some of the Q&A was going on. But further expanding with it how they view the next gen version as an important step for the game. And to me, their messaging overall with the next gen version of Cyberpunk 2077 almost feels like they're viewing it as a relaunch of sorts. They want to get this next gen version right, especially for console users who still don't exactly have the premier experience. And something else they mentioned several times when talking about the next gen version is learning from past mistakes and learning from the past year in general. So to me, what it seems like is going on is that the next gen version might be able to slip through into 2021, but it seems pretty unlikely, and CDPR aren't going to force it to come out this year. Obviously, they made that disastrous decision once before with the original release of the game, and I think this time they just really want this to be right and actually convince a lot of people, hey, the game's at least mostly better now. So to me, I would imagine it's either a December release or likely not actually releasing in 2021 at all. They also mentioned they are working on the first expansion. One of the interesting aspects when it comes to this overall is we still don't really know much about the future. Obviously now we get some more confirmation and some more details about the next gen version, but as far as like the DLCs or even future updates, on future updates, they basically have just said that they're kind of getting the game to a point where it's getting more and more fixed, and as some of the bugs are gone, they'll be able to transition more to actually improving the game. So overhauling things like AI, some of the experience and those features being improved, but they don't really get into concrete details with this, or at least they haven't yet. Of course, police AI being one of the biggest things to just get tons of criticism, but many other aspects of the game could definitely use this kind of update. And it seems like the release strategy with Cyberpunk is to package the DLC with these updates to also sweeten the deal in that regard. And I wouldn't be shocked if this next gen version will ship with the New Game Plus DLC, because obviously a ton of people are probably going to be reinterested in playing the game again, and a New Game Plus will maybe even get more people to try it again. Which on that note, they also give some pretty interesting figures on the employees working on the game and the employee base at CDPR overall, as they describe how there are 160 people working on the first Cyberpunk expansion, and seemingly it's been that way since June based on this chart. There are 70 more on unannounced projects, likely their next game, but also perhaps some of those multiplayer systems for future titles. And from this slide overall, we could see something that they later described, where over time, as they were improving Cyberpunk 2077, people were being taken off of the base game fixing and moved on to other projects, in this case, particularly the expansions and future projects. Which sounds bad, but at the same time, this is representative of the team that worked on patch 1.3, unless the team was even smaller than it's shown to be in this graph. And on that note, there's still a huge portion of CDPR actually working on Cyberpunk patching and the next gen version. They actually combine them in one group. Seems like there's over 200 employees still working on the game and about 40% of the company overall. Their communication has definitely been sparse over the past 6 months or so, but it's not because they're not working. Clearly, they have a lot of people on this project. They're just somehow on about a 2-month patch schedule right now. One of the other interesting things that wasn't explicitly talked about, but was actually data mined and found around patch 1.3 and became a big talking point after it released, was some more updates around the multiplayer, as some of the files on multiplayer saw updates with patch 1.3 suggesting it was still being worked on. Now, this really isn't news because CDPR never said they weren't working on multiplayer, just that they weren't going to release a standalone multiplayer game. Instead, the multiplayer would be added gradually, like they'd add some basic functionality, listen to feedback, iterate on that, etc. And it seems like that initial functionality is still being worked on. And again, as I mentioned before, I wouldn't wouldn't be shocked if that's in the other projects section of this chart. One of the big questions that went on all throughout this and kind of got skirted around was copies sold on PlayStation. During the previous earnings call, the PlayStation Store re-edition had just happened, but it wasn't actually included in the earnings report. They were talking about Q1, it technically happened in Q2, so they kind of acknowledged that it had happened, but wouldn't give any concrete numbers. And unfortunately, this time around, they do the same, but we actually do have some numbers based off their financial data, as well as just numbers overall from PlayStation. So no direct answers on copies sold or an improvement on copies sold, but one of the things they do talk about is how it seems like they had some retailers who had higher than expected units moved, and some other ones that had lower than expected units moved. So it seems like there was at least a bump with PlayStation, obviously, as you could expect, although something that is super interesting that I haven't seen getting talked about much is right after returning to PlayStation, Cyberpunk became the best-selling PS4 game, which was pretty shocking. It was only added at the end of June, and it topped the overall chart for June, although it didn't have a ton of competition. But if you look at July's chart, it actually is just off the chart altogether. So it really seems like this was a blip, not consistent sales. With the reemergence, a ton of people bought it again, but obviously that did not remain, as again, it fell over 20 spots at least. Although conversely, on Steam, it has been regularly gaining players since it did re-release on the PlayStation Store. Actually, fairly significant gains over the past few months, likely thanks to modding and patch 1.3. Although as far as the financials of CDPR and how the company's doing overall, it's kind of a mixed bag, because in one sense, they actually did have revenue up about 30% over last year. That being their revenue overall, not actually how much money they took home. That's a decent sized increase, but this company is definitely paying for their mistakes because their actual profits were about 30% lower. And looking at their financials, it really seems like the big thing to blame is just continued support for Cyberpunk 2077, which naturally would always be an expense for the company. It's not like companies just release games and then stop updating them, or at least most companies don't do that. But of course, with Cyberpunk and how much additional investment had to go into the game, that was significant. And one of the other big factors to consider was that since Cyberpunk basically needed a whole nother year of updates before they really got into any of the extra content, and that's even assuming it's 1 year, we obviously don't know when expansions or even more DLCs will come out, but since it pushed everything else back so far, those additional revenue streams just never came. Like, there's a ton of people who are probably just waiting for the next gen version to buy the game. There's a ton of people waiting for expansions, and the expansion revenue wasn't there. So it made the profit margins overall for CDPR much lower due to the extra time as well as the extra resources they had to pour into actually fixing the game. Plus, also due to just the reputation, this game has been acquirable for not much money. You just recently get it for $10 at Best Buy for consoles, which is really not that much, and even right now for about $20 to $25 for physical copies on consoles on Amazon. It's definitely not holding its price that well because they obviously have way too many copies and are just trying to move them at this point. But also overall, this tells a pretty clear story. CDPR definitely seems committed to fixing this game. They're clearly putting quite a bit of money on the line and actually quite a bit of resources, again 40% of their company, on fixing as well as the next gen patch. It's actually pretty convenient they coupled those together, and it's not like it was blowing things out of the water sales wise. They did make some additional money, and I wouldn't be surprised if that initial return to PlayStation was a bit surprising, but it seems like overall things tapered off pretty quickly. And considering we're not getting sales numbers, that's normally a decent indication that things at least didn't blow expectations. So that's a current look at Cyberpunk. As far as the game itself goes, at least on PC, the modding scene is really starting to take its stride. We just saw Mega Mod release, which is the biggest mod ever, and I am working on a video for this. There's a lot to cover, so it's going to take some time. And just in general, clearly based on the player numbers, it seems like modding is gradually starting to help this game out because the player numbers are going up on PC, and it doesn't seem like that's happening to quite the same degree on Xbox or PlayStation. We can't easily see the player count, but clearly it quickly fell off the top sold games chart on PlayStation. On Xbox, it's still not back on the top 50 games. It fell off and never made a return. And if you look at the bottom of that chart, there are definitely some games you would think Cyberpunk would beat. So overall, I'm pretty curious to see what happens with the rest of this year. I have a feeling that this next gen version definitely ends up getting delayed, but I really don't think that's a bad thing. If anything, I could see a delay restoring some confidence, like they're actually giving it the time it needs. But the pace things have been evolving with the update schedule, with this probably being at the very end of the year or next year. I definitely don't think the expansions are going to be coming out in January, February, or March, likely later in the year. With that said, that's an update. Hopefully you guys found this one informative. I definitely am at least hopeful for the future of Cyberpunk. And with that said, as always, you guys again, I thank for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.